Okay, so today we are going to visit Carnac.
Carnac the Magnificent.
No, not that Carnac.
The colossal site of Carnac, Egypt is one of the largest temple complexes in the world.
No, not that one either. Although, come to think of it, I have been there too, and it's definitely worth doing a site visit there, but anyway, that's for another episode. Today, we're staying closer to home and visiting the alignments of Carnac in Brittany, and that's northwestern France. Now, what are these alignments anyway? Well, they're standing stones, kind of like Stonehenge, but not at all, actually. You see, Stonehenge is a circle, hence a henge. These are fields upon fields and rows upon rows of standing stones, most of which are oriented in the same direction, hence alignments. Now, there's a few different kinds of megalithic monuments there on site. I'm not going to get into that right now. You'll see that in the video. Now, you're probably thinking, Carnac, that doesn't sound very French, and you would be right, because Carnac is actually the anglicization, or in this case, francisation, as they'd say in French, of the Breton word Carnac. Now, Breton is a Celtic language, kind of like Welsh or Cornish or Scots Gaelic, and that would be the language that's indigenous to Brittany. Now, it's believed that that word Carnac kind of means like a cairn or a memorial marker in Old Celtic. But these things, these alignments, are actually much older than the Celts. Now, they were erected between the 3rd and the 5th millennia BC. So that's like 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. However, the site is complex. Being so old, its life covers the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, that would be when the Celts were around, the Roman times, the medieval times, and the modern times. So it's been through a lot. It's complicated. It's like an onion. There are layers.
Layers! Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
For example, one of my favorite characters from early medieval Britain, that fire and brimstone monk Gildas, he actually settled in the area after fleeing the Anglo-Saxon onslaught in Britain. He even founded a monastery nearby. And in fact, I was in town for a wedding, and the wedding ceremony took place in a church that was supposedly founded by Gildas, making it like 1,500 years old. Anyway, I digress because the origins of these alignments have nothing to do with any of that. We're talking about Gildas in the early medieval times. We're going to go back thousands of years before that to the Neolithic. Now, this video is just me kind of walking around the site riffing, talking about relevant and maybe sometimes not so relevant historical and archaeological issues. It's a bit rough and stream of consciousness, not my usual organized self, but hey, it was before I became kind of a big deal and a mega celebrity.
And I can't deny the fact that you like me. Right now, you like me.
So yeah, I hope it's tolerable for you. Something a little bit different for today's site visit. So I'm here in Carnac. In French, these are les alignements de Carnac. This is in Brittany, which is the northwestern tip of France that sort of sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is sort of, I hate to use a trope, but it's like the Stonehenge of France. Now, some similarities with Stonehenge, but very many differences. So, first of all, yes, these are big stones. They're megaliths. But that really just is a general term for megalith means a big stone. Mega is big, lith is stone. Now, beyond that, this is older than Stonehenge by and large. So Stonehenge was built between 3000 and 2000 BC. This may overlap with that a little bit. These are between 5000 and 3000 BC, roughly. However, you can already see some big differences. So here at Carnac, you have the standing stones all in alignment, almost creating pathways. And you have three different kinds of monuments here. So it's not only these are actually called Menhirs, which are just solitary standing stones by themselves, but they can create patterns and pathways. So you have Menhirs here. You have Dolmens, which are the remains of stone chambers of tombs, so usually communal tombs. And so those are after the earth that's on top of them has kind of disappeared and worn away. You have some of those in the UK too, sure, but they have them here. And then they also have tumuli, which are the original tombs. They're dolmens, but with the earth over them. So here you have menhirs, tumuli, and dolmens. Now, as I said, this was older. These stones also are a little more local. Some of them came from right around here. Others, some kilometers away. I think maybe as far as 10 kilometers away. Of course, we know Stonehenge, some of that stone is fairly local, but some of it came all the way from Wales, so it was brought, from a further location. Now, even though this is earlier, it's still generally speaking the Megalithic, the Neolithic time. This is when communities really were making the transition from hunter-gatherer to becoming settled farming communities. And of course, we're not really sure what this means. I mean, there's still debate raging about what Stonehenge meant. It could be some kind of ancestor worship. It could be the general explanation is for this. It's sort of pathways guiding you into a certain sacred space or landscape. There's no way of ever knowing, but that's what archaeology does. It's to find evidence that will help you paint the picture for what all of this means. Now, some more modern observations. This is located in a charming village called Carnac, but it's a huge area. So it takes about 2 hours to walk around this. So we're going to see little bits and pieces of it. But such a big change from the US and the UK. It's free to get in here. There's a €11 guided tour, which doesn't take you around too much, but it's an hour talk. I don't have time to do that now because I have to go to a wedding, but so I'm going to show myself around, but 2 hours free parking. And it's a very different attitude in a lot of Europe versus the US and the UK, which is geographically Europe, but no more politically, where heritage is seen as, a luxury. Here it's seen as part of who the people are and the nation. Now, of course, there's costs and benefits of some of that. I mean, one of the reasons the sites are very well kept up in the US and the UK is because they're so expensive to get into. That restricts the access. And here, of course, being free, everyone can go, which is wonderful. Right now, the state of preservation of the site that I'm seeing is good. There was a visitor center that had a video. I must say, the museum part of it, there really wasn't one. It was more of a gift shop. There is a museum in town, which I will check out, a prehistoric museum if I get a chance. And we have a beautiful day, which it wasn't supposed to be, so I'm happy about that. So here you can just see some more of those pathways, how they're kind of all in a row, leading in different directions. And this is just the first spot. We've got 2-hour walk ahead. So this first area is called Ménec. It's actually, the whole village was built within the sort of stone field. I assume some of it's been taken down, that village. This has, I think, more than 1,000 stones. I think it's about 1,050, and it's almost a kilometer long, 950 meters. So that gives you a sense of the scale of this place. And this is only about 1/5 of the site. So it's going to be a long, full walk through all of this, but it's a beautiful walk, you can see. And once again, I have to emphasize it's free, which you won't find in most countries. And that says something about the French and their view of heritage. Of course, right now, some of that is, you could say, under attack or in doubt, because there are violent riots all over France at the moment. It's calmed down a little bit since last week, but that raises questions. Who does this heritage speak to? The problems with newer populations here, do they feel part of this heritage? Does this heritage have a role to play in perhaps creating some sense of unity or shared culture, shared history? You know, these kinds of standing stones, although this site is unique, being by far, I think, the largest landscape like this in Europe, this is not unique. You can find, I saw plenty of this, for example, in Portugal when I was there for a month during COVID. You can find these all over the Near East. So it is something that people share, but it's in its own way uniquely French. So it raises questions about heritage, but one thing we can say is the French take their heritage very seriously, and so visiting some of these sites, they want the people here to take it seriously as well as visitors. Just some frame of reference, I used to live in Paris. Now, I haven't been to Versailles, I haven't been to the Louvre in some years, but those are cheaper than, your average old country house visit in the UK or a plantation visit in South Carolina, where my mom has recently relocated. So it just gives you a sense you can spend more money at one plantation site in South Carolina that you can to visit the Louvre or Versailles. And of course, this is free. Another thing to think about as we're walking here, and it just keeps going and going, is, of course, I'm seeing tourists here. So far, all domestic tourists, not foreign. But I see a lot of local people here just walking their dogs, going for a jog. And that's something else to think about, is heritage in visiting these places. There you may see in the distance someone biking through. Is this stuff just like for special occasions that you go to have your heritage hour or your outing on Saturday or Sunday when the weather's nice, or is this something that's just part of your life? And is there value in that, walking through these spaces and just sort of imbibing them as part of your daily routine? And what sort of sentiments or feelings, if any, does that produce? Something to think about. It reminded me of in the U.S., if you go to, for example, the South Virginia, which is a state full of battlefields. For me, visiting those places, Yorktown, wherever, is that's a special experience. And yet, for people who live there, they'll just go walking their dog or jogging along some of these battle sites. These are battle sites where the course of American history was decided, where lots of people died, so they're sacred sites in a sense. Of course, a place like this, we understand less about the meaning, but there's, of course, other sites like that in France. One of the things that happened here recently, it made some news. I don't know where this place is, but apparently some part of the site that hasn't been properly surveyed, so arguably part of the site, but maybe not firmly established, was recently destroyed to build a DIY shop. So, notwithstanding what I just said about them taking these sites, very good care of them and taking them seriously here in France, even now that kind of stuff still happens. Of course, times like earlier in the 20th century, a lot of times historic buildings and sites were destroyed to build often horrible modern buildings that themselves didn't last very long. That was a big thing in the 60s and 70s. That was largely in the West and even some parts of Asia. Communism did something a little bit different. Of course, the Soviets and the Chinese destroyed a lot of their own heritage during the Cultural Revolution in China and the Bolshevik Revolution, destroying all the old religion and all the bad old stuff. But they then later on sort of enhanced those things and played them up to instill a lot of national pride. Communism, of course, is supposed to be international, but that didn't last very long, right? Even Stalin declared Russian communism to be superior to other forms of Soviet communism. So nationalism crept in, and then a lot of the heritage sites were talked up, funded very well, enhanced, and that's the key, they were enhanced. So a lot of the sites were altered. This isn't a communist country, but I think about some of the ancient sites in Iraq under Saddam Hussein that were kind of Disneyfied. But in any event, as good a job as France does, even here you had some destruction of the site very recently. That was a decision by a local mayor, I believe, and very controversial. So we can't expect perfection. Heritage is something that you need to be vigilant in protecting, even in the most conscientious of countries. The Menhir field is continuing. It looks like maybe this part of the site is more damaged. The stones are there, but a lot of them are broken and weathered, so they're not that tall anymore. But you can see how far it continues, and I'm going to be walking along the whole way. Now, this is already the beginning of another field of menhirs called the Camario field, but I don't know that this is actually really different. Now, it's bisected, of course, by a modern road. Over there to the right of that house, there was an enclosure, some of which still, you see some remains of an enclosure and some isolated menhirs. But this is probably in ancient times just a continuation of the same landscape. So it's not really, it has a different name, but I don't know that it's really distinct. We have to think about who were the people who built these. The population, as far as we can tell, is not really distinct from the people who would have been in England and Britain at that time. And this part of France is called Brittany, and that sort of gives it away. For many, many years, a long time, the populations of Brittany and southern England, Britain, maybe even all of Britain were quite close, and there was trade and transport across the Channel. One of the very famous bodies found from this time, not far from Stonehenge, the Avebury Archer, I believe he came from the continent. I forget exactly where, but nowadays with modern methods, probably strontium or other isotope analysis of the skeleton, they can tell that he was not local based on the isotopes and elements in his, I guess it's teeth or maybe even skeleton. They could tell he came from the continent. Now, that kind of correspondence across the Channel lasted and was important long, long after. So I said this place is called Brittany. If you look at the signs, even the name Carnac, which I think in the local Breton language, which survives, just like Welsh survives, even Cornish is beginning to come back. These are all related languages, quote, Celtic languages. Anyway, if you look at the signs around here, even like the name Carnac on the local signs, you can tell that that's not French. So what happened was people went back and forth between Brittany and Britain. And when the Roman Empire started collapsing and there was more disorder in this part of the world, especially in Britain, people started escaping that disorder and going towards the continent. But then when the Anglo-Saxons invaded, came, and there was trouble between the local British, quote-unquote, Celtic population and the Anglo-Saxons, of course we know who won. The Anglo-Saxons did. So the belief was that a lot of people escaped from Celtic Britain and settled here in Brittany. One of those was Gildas, who wrote one of the earliest accounts of the Anglo-Saxon conquest. It was a name of a book he wrote in Latin. I'm forgetting the name, something like On the Destruction of Britain or something like that, which was a polemic full of fire and brimstone, all about how that was God's punishment for the fall and the debauchery of the Britons. But he actually escaped here to Brittany, and he settled here and died here. Somewhere around here there is an abbey. I'll find it. Won't have time to go, but yes, he wound up here as well. So that correspondence between these two populations lasted until historic times, the Middle Ages. So we've come to a nice wooded part of the path, and yes, I did just look it up. So Gildas escaped early medieval Britain right after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Anglo-Saxon conquest. He escaped to the Rhys Peninsula, which if you look at the spelling, R-H-U-Y-S, looks very much like the Welsh name, right? Rhys, which we know like John Rhys Davies. So you can see the correspondence in the languages there, Breton, and because it's a Celtic language. Now, that was the fog of the early Middle Ages. What Gildas wrote, which I did check, was something like, yes, the conquest and fall of Britain. What he wrote, even though it's a polemic and full of all kinds of nonsense about angels and birds saving people and talking and whatever else, it is a source of historical record in that time where there was really almost no records there. In fact, it's believed he may have been contemporaneous with King Arthur, or the one or several characters who actually are an inspiration for King Arthur. Anyway, I don't want to digress because that's a whole other topic. But the point is, that's the early Middle Ages, which is this really dark period in terms of there being no information. He's one of the sole sources. That seems like forever ago, that he was born about 500 AD. That's forever ago. But if you think about it, that was 3,500 years after perhaps the last stone was laid around here. So that gives you a sense of how old the site is. Very, very old. So now we're in the heart of that, I guess is called Camario, the other part of the site, which is perhaps most visited because of the size of these menhirs. Now, I don't think it's been determined definitively how they erected these things. There's some good models, good theories, but it's very similar to the stuff. I'm not too into engineering, but, you know, with those rudimentary sort of pulley systems, rolling things on logs, if you've ever seen any of the simulations for how they might have moved the blocks on the pyramids or erected Stonehenge, it's the same kind of ideas. They dug holes for these things to stand in, and some of those, I don't know about here, but I know in the UK, some of those have been excavated, and with the organic material that is underneath those stones, of course, if it's organic, you can date it. So then they have a sense, that's one of the ways they determine how old these things are. I'm assuming they've done that here. Now, the population, again, who built these things, the ancient Neolithic population, they are in no way related to the later Celtic, quote-unquote, Celtic population. This is some kind of installation here, I guess, on one of those sort of hokey experiential things. But anyway, they're not related to the quote-unquote Celtic population. I quote-unquote it because the Celtic population as such is known, sort of their heartland in Europe. The idea was they originally came from Central Asia. The steppe is in Hallstatt, Switzerland, southern Germany. The quote-unquote Celts of Britain and this area, Brittany, have their culture, so the language and a lot of the art motifs from the Latin, the twirly-whirlies, but they actually have been determined as a genetically distinct population. So the Celts of Britain are not related to those on the continent by blood, by DNA. And likewise, they're not related to these people who built this. The ancient population of Britain and Brittany, they really kind of don't leave much of a genetic trace, very, very little, which is interesting. What happened to them? We don't know. Here's another spot you can get a great view of how these things are actually all aligned and how they make what some people believe is this processional pathway into this sacred landscape. As I mentioned, you can find these menhirs too in littoral Western Europe. I visited some of them in Portugal. Just nothing of this scale, really. But that says that population was probably related somehow, and we don't know their path. And it's interesting because I was sort of mixing some of the Neolithic stuff before with the Celtic stuff. It almost seems to be the same phenomenon. So these Neolithic people probably came somewhere from Central Asia, I believe, maybe via Anatolia, via Turkey. They set these things up, so they came from east to west, but I believe when some of this stuff was dated, so the old idea used to be all civilization came from the Near East, and it spread out to these barbarian lands. When these were dated, I believe they were older than some of the examples you have in Turkey and the Middle East, or Eastern Europe as well. So that kind of torpedoed that narrative that, you know, people did come from the East. I think that's known, but that sort of the culture diffused from there. And cultural diffusion is sort of an old-fashioned archaeological idea. much maligned now. I'm not going to get it too into the debate, but the issue is that it's almost can be used in a racist kind of way, saying, okay, well, culture came from the Near East and then it sort of transplanted in Europe, and all sort of technologies and advances kind of diffused from there. It gets rid of the agency and the ability of individual people and cultures to really evolve. Cultures in different places develop different technologies and ideas on their own, independently of one another. But there also is cultural diffusion sometimes. So that's an idea that, in the righteous, what would we say, thrust to sort of deconstruct that idea, it I think went a little too far. But anyway, so in this sense, cultural diffusion, though, is not really, it's a little bit of a mystery, because yes, the people came from east to west, but these kinds of megalithic monuments seem to be older here than in other places. So who really knows? In any event, the story kind of replayed with the people we later call the Celts, because they also probably came somewhere from Central Asia. I think they also went to Anatolia and spread. However, as I mentioned, the Celts here probably were not from the original Celtic site that is known in, Switzerland and Germany. The genetic tests that had been done shown they were a distinct population. The Welsh, the Breton, the Scots, all of them, they're distinct. The Irish. I'm not sure if this is genetic or what evidence there is for this. I guess it's somewhat genetic, but that they came via the sea from Iberia, maybe originally from, who knows what originally came from Africa, but they came at some point from Anatolia throughout the Mediterranean up the West Atlantic coast, and then they wound up in Britain. So I think that's the latest thinking. But once again, it has nothing to do with these ancient monuments, which, again, that was a different population, but seems to have come the same way. It was almost history repeating itself. This is the remains, I think, of a dolmen. So this used to be, I think, an internal kind of tomb, and there you see it's even more. So it just keeps going. So the site keeps going and going. There was a thought in the, I guess, 18th and 19th century that this was all the remains of a temple, which, given the scale of it, seems ridiculous. But you could see what they were thinking, because these things are all in rows and it's very symmetric, that this was the remains of some temple. Imagine like Greek temple with the columns. Now, the latest thinking is that this is some kind of, again, a ceremonial ritual. That's a word in archaeology. When you can't explain anything, you just call it ritual. But a ritual landscape, which is supposed to represent moving from the worldly, profane space potentially into the sacred space. So this is sort of the in-between zone that's guiding you there. I mean, it's all just speculation. That's what's fun about archaeology. But you can try to, what they did with Stonehenge is sort of the astronomical archaeology to see what part of the year these things align. Does it have to do with solstices and other astronomical things? And that might give a clue. This has to do with the passage of time and the calendar and the cycles of the year, which, of course, in the Neolithic, when people became grounded, and that's when they started farming, they were no longer hunter-gatherers. Those annual cycles became very important. So when the harvest would start, when the longest and shortest days of the year, the solstices were, that all became very important. So that may have a role to play in some of these, but I don't think here. Now we're coming up on a big stone over there, a big menhir. Something we do not want to associate this site with, nor any of the other megaliths like Stonehenge. I know it's a trope to compare, but that's one people know, is we don't want to associate these with Druids. Now, Druids were real people. They lived maybe from 600, 700, 800 BC up until the Roman times. Julius Caesar. Well, so firstly, the Druids, there's very little written information about them because they didn't write anything down on purpose. to become a Druid, you had to go and study somewhere for, I think it was like decades. And then, you learned their ways and you kept it and only transmitted it orally. Julius Caesar is one of our sources for the Druids, one of our only sources. So that was around the year, 0. I think he invaded Britain in 43 AD. So that's Roman. That's a Druid. That's 2,000 years ago. Again, maybe up until 2,500, 2,700 years ago. These megaliths were built between 5,000 and 3,000 BC, so thousands of years before the Druids. Stonehenge, remember, is a little bit not quite as old. Stonehenge was built between 2 and 3,000 BC, nothing to do with the Druids. We're closer to the Druids than they were to this site in terms of time, temporally. So Druids were real, but when you see those ceremonies of Druids at Stonehenge and stuff, that's a bunch of nonsense. I'm walking near to the end of the site. There's actually, like I said, it keeps going and going, but I only have time for this much if I'm going to go to the museum and make this wedding at 2:30. But anyway, you can see a modern farm right in the middle of this, these horses. And that's a little bit about what I was talking about earlier, how much this is just sort of built into the local community, what it means to them. It probably means something different than the visitors. But remember, the people here, even if they have very long roots in this region, they're not related to the people who built or who erected these monuments. So it's just a complexity of history. You can see, you might live around here, be proud of this, have a sense of belonging, but does it belong to you any more than anyone else? Is it universal? That's what the whole concept of UNESCO is supposed to be, about universal heritage. What do these things all mean? It's complicated. That was a horse behind me. And this is some of the last remaining menhirs to see. I think there is a dolmen here. Now, back a ways, maybe I'll show that spot again. There had been a burial that was very high status, at least for the time. There was lots of jade found there, and that has to come from the Alps, I think, which, nowadays that's a short flight, but is 6,000-7,000 years ago. That was a long way away. Most people didn't venture more than a few miles or kilometers away from their house, or if they had a house where they lived. So, this must have been a very high status, wealthy person. I think they found other stones from elsewhere, maybe in the Mediterranean, other places. That's a rather tall menhir there. But this is a person who was able to command a lot of wealth at that time. And I believe within that tumulus, it was a single burial. So that means all of the things that were buried with the person, I wouldn't assume it's a he, because there were high-status female burials in Neolithic and Bronze Age times. But anyway, that was a person who was able to command a lot of wealth. Given where we are, right by this Breton peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic, maybe it's someone who had the ability to control or dominate a lot of land and sea trade routes. So this is about as far as I'm going to go. I walked through the trees a little bit. I've seen quite a lot. You could say I've gotten stoned this morning. I'm intoxicated by all the menhirs. Ha ha ha. Pun is the lowest form of humor. Oscar Wilde. Menhir itself is a Breton word, meaning something like long stone, I believe. Remember, Breton is a Celtic language, nothing to do with French. And that has its own tortured history. I mean, even my friend who I'm here for her wedding, I think her great-grandma didn't know Breton because the French had prevented it from being taught. And then maybe her grandma learned it, and then her mother didn't know. So it's a language like all over the UK, actually, with the Celtic languages that were forbidden their teaching. And they're making a comeback. Welsh has made a big comeback. Scots Gaelic is making a comeback. Of course, Gaelic, Irish Gaelic. But Cornish now, people are beginning to learn in Cornwall. There's a jogger, as I mentioned. Ménec, the language of the Isle of Man. The last native speaker of that died, I think, in the 70s or 60s. They're beginning to teach that again. So these old cultures are making a comeback. Nothing to do with anything, but those are some foals, some young horses. I thought you'd find that cute. They all look different. There's 2 white ones, but other than that, there's dark brown, light brown, spotted. I don't know enough about genetics, but they look all to be the same age. So one mom, but many different colors. I'm walking along the road now because I kind of have to hurry a bit, but this is just a different view than I had before, and you can see the size of some of these things. The ones you're seeing in front of me, I know the perspective is a little off, but those are taller than I am significantly. There is a giant one, Le Géant, which is supposedly 6 meters, about 18, 19 feet high. I didn't quite make it to that one. It's just too far, and I have to make sure I'm on time, and I do want to see the museum. And that's the thing. If you really don't know what you're looking at, all of this stuff is just stones. It's learning about it, what it is, what it means, that is what makes it so impressive. And right now, this is one of those dolmens, so you'll see they're all in a row. So that used to be a chamber. It was covered by earth, and inside was a tomb long, long ago. This one is actually pretty well preserved, so I'm glad I walked this way, even though it isn't the most pleasant way by the road. You know, you look at that, it's 6,000 years old. I recently visited some enormous tombs like this in Ireland, and those were impressive because those actually did have, and do have to this day, an astronomical alignment where I think it's during the summer solstice in one of them, the light shines through this window like a peephole which was put in above the entrance. So even in that time they understood astronomy, and remember, that's the beginning of the Neolithic period, so the cycles of the year that started to have more importance for them. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.